Open the schools, the children can't read, child left behind. We've all seen the memes and heard the news. But what happens when the most vocal and effective advocates for U.S. public school reform are right-wing politicians and a slew of ill-informed, pseudo-intellectual conservative parents who want to take away their child's privacy and right to learn even while at school? In the past and up until the present day, if a parent didn't agree with what their children were being taught in public schools, they could pull them out and start homeschooling them. In fact, in most states, you don't even need to tell your school district you're homeschooling, and as a homeschool parent, you don't even need a degree in education or pedagogy to be considered a teacher. However, I should note that not all homeschooling is equal, as we'll see later in the video. But either way, though parents are still homeschooling and even going as far as embracing the anti-school movement, more and more conservative parents are instead trying to actively change how public schools are run due to their deep distrust of anything controlled by the government, as they believe the left is trying to use K-12 schools as a way to indoctrinate students into the quote-unquote woke Marxist pipeline. It's not just about liberal arts colleges anymore. There are real problems with public schools that we'll get to. They're far from perfect and in many aspects are failing today's youth, but not for the reasons conservative parents, rights activists who aim to control their child's every move say they are. So in this video, we'll delve into why the pandemic, as well as the racial and class uprisings of 2020 and 2021, radicalized those on the right to create the parents' rights movement in the first place, as well as get into the actual legislature that's been proposed and passed, some of which ban talks about racism and sexism in school, as well as forcibly outs LGBTQ children to their schools and parents. And lastly, we'll discuss parents who have totally unhinged themselves from reality and have decided any form of school, whether it be a public or home-based curriculum, just doesn't serve them or their kids and how detrimental that is. And before we get really into it, if you're new to this channel, I've made plenty of videos about how strongly I feel about the rights of children, from adultism to child-parent estrangement to the effect of gifted and slow labels in school to the villainization of bully victims, which I think would be interesting for you to check out if you like this video. And if you're a returning subscriber, you already know how much topics like this mean to me. So without further ado, I present to you the conservative anti-school iceberg. Part 1. What radicalized the parents? In March of 2020, when the world shut down, schools went remote with online Zoom classes where severely underpaid teachers would attempt to teach their pupils through video chat with varying degrees of success. Researchers Dr. Stephanie Jones and Dr. Emily Hanno of the Early Learning Study program at Harvard discovered in their investigation of how children adapted to pandemic learning that it's hard to get kids to use the screen as their main mode of learning. Dr. Jones said in an edcast, they have to learn how to do that, and that of course comes with all kinds of challenges. Sometimes when kids are struggling and they're frustrated, their behavior shifts. It can look more negative, more dysregulated. They fall apart more often. I honestly can't even begin to imagine how hard it was not only as a teacher and parent, but as a kid who's only like 5 or 6 years old to learn via video chat when you're used to being in a classroom setting. It sounds awful. Rather than the government giving out monthly stipends to low-income families and teachers to survive during an unprecedented time in human history, however, and letting kids rest and take off from school in order to deal with this new normal, the U.S. government's action plan during the pandemic was one of inaction, and new information suggests that the Pentagon pushed anti-vax propaganda online to discredit China. So that's great. But what's most important to note for the purposes of this video is that the pandemic and remote learning for kids ages K through 12, 5 to 18, is that for the first time, parents were able to watch their child's lessons, see what was being taught, and many of them didn't like what they saw.
The schools are failing us, the public schools, and especially when they got locked down with the COVID situation, they were able to see the curriculums of what the children were learning, and they felt that it just was not appropriate.
As Education Week writer Libby Stanford noted in their article entitled What the Parents' Rights Movement Forced Schools to Do, the COVID-19 pandemic opened the digital doors to classrooms. For many parents, it was the first time seeing a daily lesson. Some were appalled by the content about race, gender identity, and sexuality, igniting a fervor that led to the conservative parents' rights movement and its calls for giving parents more control over curriculum and books, and organized political efforts from groups such as Moms for Liberty to win school board majorities. Many districts saw increased attendance at school board meetings as districts made choices about COVID-19 precautions. Typically under-the-radar school board races became heated. This was especially rampant with conservative parents wanting to return to normal by sending their kids to school maskless and fighting for their right to remain unvaccinated, threatening the lives of children and teachers. The push for parents' rights reached the national political stage after Virginia Governor Glenn Youngkin, a Republican, won his election in 2021 on a parents' rights rights platform. Glenn Youngin clinched the deal by working to ban Toni Morrison's Beloved in Virginia schools, citing that parents should be able to ban books in the school's curriculum that contain sexual content, even if it's for an 18-year-old's English class. And this gets to the real heart of the parents' rights movement. It's not about addressing actual problems with public schools, such as helping underfunded public schools in low-income areas, erasing student lunch debt, and giving underpaid teachers raises, or even about how elementary and middle school students have been behind in reading and math since 2012, but rather it's about banning anything that goes against conservatism and liberty by ironically taking other people's freedoms away. And this hypocrisy is fundamental to the conservative right. Republicans and those on the right say they hate government intervention, hands off our kids, will decry government-run schools, but then use that same big government to enact their own bigoted policies. The mechanisms for change are only bad when in the hands of our enemy, is essentially the definition of party politics in the US. In hindsight, remote learning had huge consequences for public schools and students because it meant private class discussion about mature themes in literature and history were no longer private. And even more benign elementary and middle school discussions about how girls can do anything boys can do and vice versa meant that the teacher's own beliefs and what they were instilling into their students was known to the parents. Bringing the class into the home meant that parents now had full access to what their kids were up to, and many ended up wedging themselves between their kids and teachers' professional relationship, which honestly to me is sacred. Kids need privacy, need a separate place to go aside from their home, need to be away from their parents in order to create their own identity and be exposed to different and challenging ideas. And most importantly, they need to have other caring adults in their lives who they can be open with, but with forced home remote learning, that was made impossible. Aside from parents being unhappy with the curriculum, teachers, and COVID restrictions, many also weren't happy with the discussions about race during the end of the 2020 school year. The murders of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd incited protests across the nation. Kids everywhere were trying to make sense of state-sanctioned racist violence, and school was an outlet to have those talks. But this only further pushed many white conservative parents to the right and made them even more adamant that something had to be done about the woke indoctrination their kids were getting in public schools. Parents' rights groups such as Moms for Liberty was founded in 2021, and No Left Turn in Education was founded in 2020. In fact, the founder of No Left Turn in Education, Dr. Elena Fishbein, cites the George Floyd protests and the public school's reaction to them as to why she created the organization. Her website reads, "In June, shortly after the death of George Floyd and the protests, rioting, and looting that ensued, the principal of my children's elementary school issued a message to parents that shocked me." It described a hastily drawn-up plan by a cultural proficiency committee at the school to offer explicit lessons on equity and race for our students. Despite the fact that the school already offers a robust curriculum that includes 5 distinct programs plus Black History Month to help foster empathy, understanding, and compassion in students, they felt an urgent need to execute additional lessons in cultural proficiency to children starting in kindergarten 2 days before the conclusion of the school year. So what's the problem? These lessons included different topics such as diversity, racism, justice, equity, and privilege. But instead of reaffirming and fostering the wholesome teachings of MLK Jr., the lessons in this new cultural proficiency unit incorporated specific books that described whiteness as entitlement to steal land, garner riches, and get special treatment. And though she's so up in arms about this, she states that she was able to opt her kids out of the lesson. So public schools aren't even forcing this onto children. Need I say more? For these people, simply talking about and acknowledging a historical fact like the enslavement of Black people is beyond the pale. And the parents' rights people who claim to love their children so much and just want to protect them also have created laws to forcibly out trans and gay students to their parents because they have a right to know. These advocates essentially want to infiltrate the public school system so their children have no more privacy and no place to explore ideas other than those that are parent approved, and that should terrify you no matter who you are. Parents enmeshing themselves this deeply into their child's life at any level, whether it be in the books they read, to what they talk about in class, to their gender identity and sexual orientation, is not right. Like, get a life. What kind of parent has this much energy? This is anecdotal, but I was in a reading group in middle school at the library, and my parents were interrogating the reference librarian on what we'd be reading and imposing their own opinions on what we should be reading, such as Anne of Green Gables. And the facilitator was like, no, we're reading contemporary YA like Twilight. And honestly, I'm so grateful that my public library and school library had books that dealt with themes that some adults might find inappropriate and with no literary merit just because they weren't written in the 1800s. I'm glad other adults in my life, aside from my parent, realized realize that contemporary YA has value, and that to get kids into reading, starting with books written a couple hundred years ago isn't always going to work for everyone. It's so vital as a kid to have other adults have an input in your life, not just one or two people get to have a final say, because sometimes those one or two people are oppressive and restrictive and may even be abusive. And to the parents watching, just because you're a parent doesn't make you a child care expert or a qualified caretaker or educator. I think what frustrates me the most about these white conservative parents' rights activists is that they're fighting a battle that doesn't exist. There is no harm in affirming your child's gender or letting them experiment on their own. There's no harm in just telling kids that you can express your gender however you want to, no matter your assigned sex. There's no harm in talking about race and the history of racism and privilege. There's no harm in letting kids come out when they're ready. Not to mention, are public schools even that radical or diverse? School districts in the US are heavily segregated through gerrymandering and class status, meaning that most schools in poor areas are populated by Black and Hispanic populations, and schools in rich areas are mainly white and Republican, and the teachers also usually reflect this. As someone who grew up in a wealthy white suburb in a good public school district, we had one Black teacher and one Asian teacher, but they didn't appear until senior year of high school. A lot of these white parents come from white school districts where diversity is rarely ever taught or mentioned or even a problem, and where minority students are bullied relentlessly. So what are they so afraid of? Not to mention, there's always been the option to opt out, as the founder of No Left Turn put it so eloquently. And even if we take them in good faith, like maybe they want to push the Stop Woke bill in schools in order to prevent a race war, ignoring the problem won't make it go away. Their priorities are just so misguided and delusional. The only explanation is that they're just hideously and heinously racist, and thus must enshrine into law that their status as wealthy white cishet people will never change. Lastly, and most importantly, parents already have rights. No one is taking away parents' rights by championing the community and teachers. If you feel threatened by your child's teacher simply because they're a teacher employed by the government, that's on you. A comment I see a lot in these conservative mom groups is that you're sending your kid to be with a stranger for 8 hours a day, how dare you? And though I agree that school shouldn't be 8 hours a day, I disagree with the argument that you should automatically dismiss public school teachers as strangers and that you can't trust them to watch your child because their beliefs might be different from yours. That's some intense paranoia, and you should seek help. Yes, there are some horrible teachers out there that only get into the profession to have power over children, but most teachers love kids, love their job, dedicate their lives to a low-paying but invaluable profession, and it's your fault if your child's teacher is a stranger for you. Get to know your community, get to know the adults your kids are spending time with, open yourself up to new possibilities. A large part of the rights platform is to sow distrust in community and institutions, like in schools and teachers, so they can rework them to fit their ideology. They do this by fear-mongering and championing hyper-individuality. Every man is an island, everyone is out to get you, there's no such thing as a free lunch, and you alone have the sole right to dictate everything for your child. Which in theory, I guess, sounds nice, until you remember that not every parent has their child's best interests at heart. One of the clauses in the Parents' Bill of Rights Act we'll get into later is how all parents are able to look at the curriculum, know what books are being stocked in the library, and object to whatever they want to, and their child has no say. But if every parent in the district has a voice, no one does. And that's by design, because it'll leave almost nothing left. So no, not everyone and anyone should be able to dictate what's in schools. It should be left up to educated professionals who have backgrounds in childcare and teaching. But that's the whole point. Republicans don't want it to be. They say they champion self-determinism to protect liberty, but the real reason they do it is because it's an easy way to weasel their political ideologies into established systems. Democracy is good, and we shouldn't get in the way of everyone being entitled to their opinion, right? And the parents' rights people really have a leg up, because it's even harder to argue against concerned parents. And though in theory this idea of looking over the curriculum is good for minorities, specifically who may want to remove offensive works or add books to the curriculum about race, gender, and sexual orientation, that's actually not even possible, as it conflicts with the Stop Woke bill, which many states have adopted, that prohibits class discussion of said taboo topics. So now let's finally talk about what the parents' rights movement has gotten done. Part 2, the legislation. In the past 4 years at both the state and federal levels, conservative politicians and parents alike have been working to make schools as conservative as possible, where topics such as gender, sex, and race are not to be discussed even in contemporary times of social upheaval, and when these issues affect real kids' lives. And Republican Florida Governor Ron DeSantis and his followers such as Joe Harding and Dennis Baxley, as well as Mike Johnson of Louisiana, have been the leaders in this crusade against what they see as Marxist-inspired ideology, and like we've discussed, woke indoctrination. One of the acts we'll be discussing is literally called Stop Woke. So one of the first bills strengthening parental rights while their children are at school was passed in Florida during March of 2022. It was deemed the Parental Rights in Education Act, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, and regulated public schools in Florida. According to a summary of the bill on the Florida State website, the bill reinforces the parent's fundamental right to make decisions regarding care and upbringing of his or her child in the public school setting. The bill requires each district school board to adopt procedures for notifying a student's parent if there is a change in services or monitoring related to the student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being. All procedures adopted under the bill must require school district personnel to encourage a student to discuss issues related to his or her well-being with his or her parent. The bill prohibits a school district from maintaining procedures that require school district personnel to withhold from a parent or encourage a student to withhold information related to a student's mental, emotional, or physical health or well-being. Essentially, as a child in a public K-12 school in Florida, you have no more private life once you enter school. In addition, the law prohibits public schools from adopting procedures or student support forms that maintain the confidentiality of a disclosure by a student, including that of their gender identity or sexual orientation, from parents, and requires public schools to bear all the costs of all lawsuits filed by aggrieved parents. You can't be yourself, you can't confide in other trusted adults without the underlying threat that they could tell your parents, even if those parents aren't understanding. Though there is a clause in the bill that states, school district procedures may authorize school district personnel to withhold information only for a reasonable belief that disclosure would subject the student to abuse, abandonment, or neglect. But even if your parents might not do those things to you, do you really want your teachers reporting your behavior, sexuality, and gender identity to your parents without your consent? You basically can't even tell a guidance counselor what your sexual orientation is or preferred pronouns are without already being forced to come out to your family. How is that okay? How is that going to help kids? School is already really hard to navigate for trans and gender non-conforming and non-straight kids. Imagine making it even harder. Furthermore, the bill prohibits classroom instruction on sexual orientation or gender identity in kindergarten through 3rd grade or in any manner deemed to be against state standards in all grades. This is under the guise of protecting children, but in reality it's to discriminate and discourage an exploration of gender and sexual identity that goes against anything non-cis or heteronormative. I doubt they're banning books about heterosexual pairings. Boys can't be told that it's okay for them to wear dresses, for example, and libraries can't have books about same-sex relationships. A year later, in 2023, the Florida Board of Education later expanded the ban on teaching about sexual orientation or gender identity to all grades K through 12, with the exception of health or reproductive courses. One of the last parts of the bill reads, at the beginning of each school year, a school district must notify parents of all healthcare services offered at their student's school and provide parents the opportunity to individually consent to or decline each service. Additionally, schools may not administer a well-being questionnaire or health screening form to a student in kindergarten through grade 3 without first receiving consent from the student's parent. This means that kids K through 3 can't confide in the school nurse or teachers that they might be being abused physically or emotionally, nor can staff inquire of a student they may suspect is a victim because a parent may be the abuser or the parent could be covering up the abuse done by someone else. The somewhat good news is that after multiple lawsuits in March of 2024, the Don't Say Gay law in Florida was narrowed to restrict only the direct teaching of gender identity and sexual orientation in classrooms, while once again allowing discussions of LGBTQ+ concepts between teachers and students and allowing libraries to carry LGBTQ+ related books. And on another semi-positive note, the Stop Sexualization of Children Act, which was basically the national Don't Say Gay bill that was introduced in October of 2022, hasn't been passed, though it's supported by Representative Mike Johnson of Louisiana and 32 additional Republican members of Congress, and probably will come into effect if Project 2025 ever comes to fruition, which we'll get into later. In the end, according to a PBS interview, the law is still in effect, as well as a lot of these policies that were kind of inspired by the law, things like banning AP African American history because there was a queer theory unit, or making it so that sociology is no longer a core curriculum course for undergrads here because it talked about human sexuality. So basically the law is not overturned and it's not repealed, it's still very much in effect, but it's also a big win for LGBTQ+ advocates, folks who have lived under this law for 2 years and were afraid to be out publicly in the school system, fearing what might happen if you said the wrong thing, or as a teacher, may have the wrong book in their classroom. Kids can read books with gay characters again. Teachers can put up safe space stickers and also have gay straight alliances and other kinds of LGBTQ clubs at schools. Though I haven't found out if this affects the part where children's sexual and gender identity is still kept private from parents or forcibly divulged by the school district, nor have I read news about the health and wellness screening not needing a parent's consent. If you have any info about this, please leave it down below. So that was March of 2022, now on to April 2022, when the Stop Woke bill was passed in Florida, and then copied by many other states across the US, including South Carolina, Tennessee, Idaho, Texas, and New Hampshire. In other states, bills were introduced like in New York and New Jersey, but were not signed into law. The Stop Woke bill itself stands for Stop Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees Act, which prohibits instruction that individuals share responsibility for others' past actions by virtue of their race, sex, or national origin. Basically, white people and men have no responsibility nor experience any benefits from their forebears, and to insinuate that they do is unacceptable and punishable by the withholding of state and federal funds. This act was part of the anti-critical race theory movement post-Black Lives Matter protests of the summer of 2020 and 2021 during the first few years of the pandemic. And though CRT has been demonized by news outlets and conservative politicians and parents, all it means is that racism is systemic and historical and baked into laws and rules, and not based only on individuals' prejudices. The Stop Woke Act contains 8 main points that read as such, and yes, I'm going to go into all of them, so strap in. No teacher, administrator, or other employee of a school district shall require or make part of a course the following concepts. Number 1. One race or sex is inherently superior to another race or sex, which is a good thing to sign into law. We shouldn't teach that, but later we'll get into how the vagueness of this makes it impossible to decipher in which context this clause applies. Number 2. An individual, by virtue of his or her race or sex, is inherently racist or sexist or oppressive, whether unconsciously or consciously. They really cover their bases here. Number 3. An individual should be discriminated against or receive adverse treatment solely or partly because of his or her race or sex. Members of one race or sex cannot and should not attempt to treat others without respect to race or sex. Honestly, I found this one very confusing. Does this mean we can acknowledge someone's race or sex because as it reads it's like a double negative? Doesn't this contradict like the previous statements? The next one is an individual's moral character is necessarily determined by his race or sex. Next, an individual by virtue of his race or sex bears responsibility for actions committed in the past by other members of the same race or sex. Again, they're very thorough, like the white people are not taking responsibility for anything, even though they know exactly what they did. The next one is no teacher shall make any individual feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress on account of his or her race or sex. And I feel like this one is good, like minorities shouldn't be bullied or made to feel bad for who they are, but it's tainted by the fact that this is mainly only in place to coddle white students for feeling bad about the past and stop them from feeling white guilt. The last one is no teacher should teach meritocracy or traits such as hard work ethic are racist or sexist or were created by members of a particular race to oppress members of another race. This one is also hard to interpret. Are they referring to the model minority myth? Like, if so, that's good. Teachers shouldn't be perpetuating this idea that stereotypes are true. But then the ending ruins it because stereotypes were meant to oppress certain races, and that's a real thing. Why can't we learn about that? Matthew Bunch, who teaches advanced placement in Miami-Dade County, said to Time magazine in 2022 he's dreading teaching Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from a Birmingham jail next year because it addresses citizens' right to challenge the government if they feel like their rights are being violated. I don't know how, without trampling on one of those landmines, we can actually talk about the document and what it means and what it influences. Supposedly, these new anti-CRT guidelines aren't meant to be construed as prohibiting any professional development training for teachers related to issues of addressing unconscious bias within the context of teaching certain literary or historical concepts or issues related to the impacts of historical or past discriminatory policies. But it's hard not to construe them as such. How can you teach the history of black enslavement in the US without violating Clause 7, making people feel discomfort, guilt, or anguish about real historical events? How can you teach about Martin Luther King Jr.'s life without talking about white supremacy, which tramples over Clause 8? Schools should not teach that stereotypes of one racial group were created to oppress another. History is offensive and uncomfortable, so it's understandable that teachers rightfully don't know what's okay and what's not. Just because you put a little note at the end that this isn't to be misconstrued doesn't mean it won't be. In South Carolina, an anti-CRT section was incorporated into the education section of H4100, the state budget bill, which was passed in June of 2021, even before Florida's. The bill prohibits schools receiving state funding from teaching specified concepts regarding sex and race. In Tennessee, House Bill 580, which was signed by Governor Lee in May of 2021, bans public school districts and public charter schools from teaching certain concepts about race, sex, and and the United States withholds funding for violations. The New Jersey bill would have prohibited the teaching of critical race theory in public schools and prohibited public classroom teachers from engaging in political, ideological, or religious advocacy in the classroom. In New York, they proposed to have the same list of rules that are used in Florida, but the bill was never passed. And in recent news, as of March of 2024, the 11th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals upheld Judge Walker's injunction with Judge Britt Grant, describing Florida's Stop Woke legislation as the latest attempt to control speech by recharacterizing it as conduct. The court found the law was too vague to be enforced and that it was unconstitutional because it targeted ideas. By limiting its restrictions to a list of ideas designed as offensive, the act targets speech based on its content, and by barring only speech that endorses any of those ideas, it penalizes certain viewpoints. The greatest First Amendment sin, Grant wrote in his opinion. So it looks like Stop Woke in Florida at least has been overturned for now, or at least found to be unconstitutional. The next piece of legislation that was passed by Republicans was the Parent Bill of Rights Act, which, unlike the previous two acts, has made it all the way to Congress. In March of 2023, the Parents' Bill of Rights passed on a 213 to 208 vote. It now sits in the Senate for consideration and has been sitting there since March 27th of that year. Though it hasn't been passed, it's important to know what it contains because it sits ready to go for a Trump 2025 presidency. In the 2025 project, Republicans say that they want to shutter the Department of Education and leave education requirements up to states. In their own words, the department is a convenient one-stop shop for the woke education cartel, which, as the COVID era showed, is not particularly concerned with children's education. Schools should be responsive to parents rather than to leftist advocates intent on indoctrination, and the more the federal government is involved in education, the less responsive to parents the public schools will be. This department is an example of federal intrusion into a traditionally state and local realm. For the sake of American children, Congress should shutter it and return control of education to the states. As for the Secretary of Education, they should insist that the department serve parents and American ideals, not advocates whose message is that children can choose their own sex, that America is systemically racist, that math itself is racist, and that Martin Luther King Jr.'s ideal colorblind society should be rejected in favor of reinstating a color-conscious society. The next head of this department will have a lot to do, and hopefully culminating in the department's closure and the salutary restoration of educational control to states, localities, and parents. Their biggest fear is that public schools could be required to assist a child with a social or medical gender transition without parental consent, or to withhold information from parents about a children's social transition. For example, changing their names or gender markers. They also say they want to work to pass a federal Parents' Bill of Rights that restores parental rights as a top-tier right. Such legislation would give families a fair hearing in court when the federal government enforces any policy against parents in a way that undermines their right and responsibility to raise, educate, and care for their children. The law would require the government to satisfy strict scrutiny, the highest standard of judicial review, when the government infringes on parental rights. So let's look into this more closely. The Parents' Bill of Rights, as it sits in the Senate presently, establishes various rights of parents and guardians regarding the public elementary or secondary school education, including secondary career and technical education of their children. Local education agencies, or LEAs, and schools must comply with the requirements of the bill in order to receive federal education funds. Specifically, the bill requires schools to notify parents and guardians of their rights regarding the education of their children. These rights include the right to review the curriculum of their child's school, know if the state alters its challenging academic standards, meet with each teacher of their child at least twice each school year, review the budget, including all revenues and expenditures of their child's school, inspect the books and other reading materials in the library of their child's school, address the school board of the LEA, receive information about violent activity in their child's school, and know if their child is not grade level proficient in reading or language arts at the end of the 3rd grade. Additional rights include the right to receive information about any plans to eliminate gifted and talented programs or college credit programs in their child's school, know the total number of school counselors in the child's school, know if their child's school operates, sponsors, or facilitates athletic programs or activities that permit an individual whose biological sex is male to participate in an athletic program or activity that is designed for individuals whose biological sex is female, know if their child's school allows an individual whose biological sex is male to use restrooms or changing rooms designed for individuals whose biological sex is female, and receive timely information about any major cyber attack against their child's school. Basically, this Parents' Bill of Rights is a way for them to not so subtly sneak in anti-trans laws into schools, taking away their child's privacy if their own parent is transphobic and abusive, as well as, like we've discussed before, weasel in all of their own ideologies. If everyone has a say, no one does. And why should non-qualified educators be dictating what their child needs to learn or not? It makes no sense. sense. A lot of these supposedly new parent rules and rights sound unnecessary to put into law. If a parent wants to look at the books and meet with their teachers and know what's in the curriculum, aren't they already allowed to do so? It's public knowledge. I guess it's good to have it written down in case schools do start teaching heinous things like the Civil War was fought over states' rights, but that's already being taught anyway. In the end, the goal is clear to me. The right wants to make public school impossible, so eventually public school, the right to a free education, and even the Department of Education ceases to exist, because how can a school exist and teachers teach if parents are running the show? Part 3. Proper homeschooling versus everything else. According to the Institution of Education Sciences, more students were homeschooled in 2019 in the US than 1999. And within these 2 decades, the percentage of students who were homeschooled first increased from 1.7% in 1999 to 3.4% in 2012. And as stated by Bright Futures New York, during the academic school year of 2021 to 2022, approximately 3.1 million students in the U.S. from grades K through 12 were homeschooled, representing approximately 6% of all school-aged children. Homeschooling and the destigmatization of it through remote learning during the pandemic was a game changer and a big reason why homeschooling has increased, alongside, of course, the parents' rights movement, which decided public schools were no longer for them when school districts forced their kids to wear a mask for their and others' safety. Many parents decided to opt out of public education and instead began homeschooling their children individually or communally, or God forbid there's another pandemic. What I can't get behind, however, is quitting public school because of masks or vaccines or because they're talking about race or gender. Not to mention when you can already opt out of all of those things anyway. There's no federal vaccine mandate, no federal mandate that you have to learn about race or gender in a way that would indoctrinate your child, but the idea that it might happen, even though it never will, is enough to mobilize some people to the extreme right. When it comes to who is more likely to be homeschooled, there's of course a class and race factor. According to the National Household Education Survey, white children from 2-income or 1-income family homes are more likely to be homeschooled. For essential workers, who are more likely to be people of color, they and their children don't have that homeschooling option as readily available. And this was felt even harder during the pandemic, where people of color were risking their lives to go to work while the white upper class got to work from home. For children from low-income families, the public school system is all they have, even though there is, of course, the school-to-prison pipeline. It just sucks. They have no good options. We'll talk about later how public school as an institution needs to be overhauled and changed, but there should always be a free option for people who need it. And it should be good, and it's not now, but that doesn't mean it shouldn't exist. According to thecounter.org, 30 million U.S. school children rely on their free school lunch. That's over 60% of all school-going children. In all, a big part of why public education is so important is because it basically is a free daycare in a country that provides none. Without it, how will lower-income parents support themselves and their families? But this is all to say that legitimate homeschooling programs don't exist, nor should remote learning be banned or seen as not real learning. For many who are disabled and who can't go to school every day without being penalized for their absences or late assignments, being able to do it from home is vital. Not to mention there are plenty of accredited homeschooling institutions that work just fine. And most homeschooling happens not because of an ideology or religious factor, but because parents don't like the environment of a public school setting, and a lot of children don't, which is fair. From bullying to the amount of hours you have to be in school, to homework, to the aforementioned late and absent punishments, to schools being more focused on standardized testing and grades, and who's gifted and who's not, as well as school shootings, there are plenty of valid reasons to homeschool or opt out of public school in general, and families should have those options. And in the US, it's incredibly easy to homeschool, as we talked about before. You don't need to tell the district you're doing it, and you don't even need to have a background in education to be a qualified homeschool teacher. But for me, this is where the problems start. There's a difference between opting out of public school and creating your own curriculum, or following another homeschooling methodology and doing legitimate remote learning, to parents pulling their kids out of school because they're just anti all types of school, period, simply because they misread Pink Floyd's Another Brick in the Wall. Believe it or not, there are some parents out there that are anti-schoolers because I don't want my kid sitting at a desk all day, or I don't want to give my kid to a stranger, and to be totally against any type of government-funded school simply because it's funded by the government, that also doesn't make sense to me. Some parents, like influencer Mommy Onami, went viral for free schooling, are basically not teaching their kid anything unless they ask them, without realizing that kids don't know what they don't know. And this, my friends and enemies, is why not every parent under the sun should have a say in public schooling and education in general. Just because you're a parent doesn't mean you know what's best for your kid or are an educational professional. For the foreseeable future, we will need public education, a Department of Education, school boards, public school teachers, and maybe not in the form it is now, but free public education should be accessible to all of those who need it and want it, and soon that basic necessity might be under attack. Unsurprisingly, the homeschool movement in the U.S. was actually promoted with the help of Republican Christians like Michael P. Ferris, who advocated for parents who wished to educate their children privately and at home. According to Susan Nozzle for Time magazine, homeschooling won adherence in the 70s and 80s as court rulings, including a 1986 Tennessee case in which Ferris was an attorney, rejected parents' efforts to get certain books, including Macbeth, removed from the curriculum on the grounds that they offended families' religious beliefs. When these litigations failed to enlist the support of courts to impose their religious preferences in public school classrooms, Ferris and his allies shifted tactics, seeking to be left alone by the government to educate their children as they saw fit. Ferris also created the Homeschool Legal Defense Association in 1983, a self-declared Christian organization, though they say they're open to people of all backgrounds. But to be frank, they use the same Republican language as every other right-leaning organization. We defend every and all people's rights to choose and say how they want to live their lives. In the end, Republicans defend individual rights because they want to defend all and any free speech, so then they can do and say horrible things without punishment. More recently, Ferris worked behind the scenes on legal documents filed by Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton to overturn the election results, Texas versus Pennsylvania, after Trump lost in 2020. To conclude, I think wanting to take your kid out of public school is fine. There are so many other and better opportunities out there, and as long as you're supporting your kids' interests and actually working to help educate them, you do you. But the rest of you who are anti-school, who don't do any work to try to help your kids make sense of the world around them, can suck my ass. Because no matter how anti-school you are, you should never be anti-learning. And lastly, and most importantly, though homeschooling and alternate schooling is great, public education cannot and should not ever go away. Conclusion, a case for public schools. In this video, we discussed the conservative anti-school iceberg, from how on the surface it looks like Republicans just want to reform public education, which it desperately needs to be reformed, but if you dive into the watery depths, they actually want to make public schools fundamentally useless and use them as a way to control free speech and children's privacy, and how though legitimate homeschooling can be successful for some children, for those in the deepest part of the iceberg, those who are the children of anti-schoolers and free schoolers, it's catastrophic. Right-wing politicians and parents' answers to failing public schools isn't to give teachers higher wages, to lessen the hours spent in school, to change the grading system and inflated importance of standardized tests, to reduce class sizes, and to try to give students a safe space away from home, but rather their answer is to take away any part of school that would give children any sense of privacy, freedom, and autonomy. Ban more books, ban discussions of race and gender, force children to stay in the closet, make public school almost totally meaningless so that by the time they do get rid of public schools and the Department of Education, it'll be more palpable. Just homeschool your kid if you don't like it. It's not that hard. Haven't you ever heard of free schooling, you snowflakes? Making your child's education an individual's problem and responsibility is a Republican's dream. More money to fund the military machine. In reality, the closing of public schools would be disastrous. Not only because they're essential for low-income families, especially single-parent homes who may not have any other option to educate their child, not only because they give out millions of lunches to kids a year, and for many, their only meal for that day is at a school, and not only because it's a place of learning, but also because kids deserve a place away from home, away from their parents, with other trusted adults and peers. They deserve to be exposed to challenging new ideas, different lifestyles and perspectives, and school, no matter what form it takes, but especially public school where you meet people from your own community, is crucial. No child should live in isolation from their community, and yet so many parents work to keep it that way because they don't see their children as their own person with rights and interests, but rather as mini-me's or as objects to abuse and criticize and belittle. One comment I see a lot as to why public schools should be side-eyed is because it's run by the government. But sorry, nationalized healthcare and publicly funded education is good, actually. Governments should take care of their citizens, especially those who can't afford privatized healthcare and education. And public schools should be overhauled. There is a school-to-prison pipeline in low-income schools that shouldn't exist. Prisons shouldn't exist. They shouldn't exist how they are now. Gerrymandered, segregated, in places where kids just learn to memorize things that aren't important just to pass a test and be molded into obedient workers who don't think for themselves. But please give teachers and children a bit more credit. Sometimes public school can be oppressive and depressing and soul-crushing, rampant with peer-on-peer abuse, but not all kids come out of it brainwashed, and not all teachers are cynical. A lot of the time, the most marginalized kids in public school come together and make long-lasting friendships that they couldn't get at home or even online, which is another place Republicans want to restrict children from socializing. Your kids need a separate life from their home life. They need to discover who they are away from you, and they can't do that if you're dictating what your teacher and district can tell tell you, or if you become your child's sole educator in life. But I do agree that in the end, public schools as large machine-like entities when it comes to learning with thousands of kids under one roof isn't sustainable nor conducive to lifelong learning. In the end, I think public schools should be more like Montessori and Waldorf types of schools with no grades, less technology or no technology, really small classroom sizes, and to focus on the humanities and nature and caring about your fellow man. But we won't be able to have that unless we address other issues at hand too, like class inequality, how school districts are segregated via de facto segregation, and changing the distrust some people have in their teachers, children, and their own community. To conclude, public school, despite all of its problems, can be a safe place to a lot of kids who don't feel safe at home, and we shouldn't be so gleeful to take it away or demonize it. But rather, we should be hopeful to reform it. And as one of those kids who felt safer at school than at home, I realize how sad it is considering how soul-crushing public school can be. But that should also just go to show you how important they are as the places where kids spend the majority of their time growing up, and they should be made to be safe for everyone. And they should be made to be away from parents. I also want to say before I wrap up that I do think it's perfectly fine to opt out of public school, and that should always be an option, but there should always also be a free public option to get an education, and that is under attack, and we should all be scared enough to do something about it. So that's it. Thanks so much for watching. If you like this one, please share, comment, give it a like, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.